Welcome to the Unpacked Project.
We're your hosts. I'm Noelle.
And I'm Miranda.
We're here to explore all things social justice. It's through casual conversations, interviews, and storytelling that we hope to inspire others to take action towards a more compassionate and equitable world.
Because honestly, it kind of sucks here sometimes.
For real, we can do better, people.
All right, let's start unpacking.
Let's talk about some alarming facts that we learned from a recent article, QAnon and Mass Digital Radicalization, Peacebuilding and the American Insurgency by Lisa Schirch. According to a Reuters poll, 13% of the U.S. population supported the siege at the Capitol. As of September 2020, nearly 60% of Republicans reportedly believed in QAnon, including newly elected members of Congress. And in August, the Wall Street Journal reported that the first 5 months of the COVID-19 pandemic saw a 600% increase in membership in the 10 largest QAnon Facebook groups.
Which is absolutely crazy to me, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm so glad that you share those facts, fairly alarming to me and actually ones that I wasn't aware of. But luckily today we have Lisa Schirch here with us. And she has this wealth of expertise and experience. So Dr. Schirch, a senior research fellow for the Toda Peace Institute, where she directs the social media, technology, and peacebuilding program. She's also a senior fellow with the Alliance for Peacebuilding and a visiting scholar in peace engineering at George Mason University's Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. A former Fulbright Fellow in East and West Africa, Schirch is the author of 11 books focused on locally led peace building, including The Ecology of Violent Extremism and Social Media Impacts on Conflict and Democracy in 2021. So thank you so much for being here today, Lisa. We absolutely appreciate you. Aside from that brief introduction, can you just share how you got into this work?
Sure. Thanks so much. It's great to be here today with the two of you, and I look forward to this conversation. So I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, which is a city that I moved to when I was 12 from Ohio. And what I learned in public school in Richmond, Virginia, is that the Civil War is not over for many people. And I lived in a mostly white community, and an African American family moved in across the street from us. And the hostility of our white neighbors to that family was so intense. All the other white kids started walking to a different bus stop, and I was there with the African American child who was my new neighbor. And, I had been taught racial justice, civil rights movement growing up in Ohio, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing, I think. And I didn't really realize how divided this country was and how much the Civil War continued to live on. That was back in the early 1980s when when that was happening in Richmond as in my childhood. And I think it shaped how I saw the world, that there were sort of historical injustices that had been suppressed and that people were divided and in conflict in my own country. As I went through college, I ended up living in Chicago, downtown urban Chicago, where I was often the only white person on the metro or the subway, the L is what they call in Chicago. And, I became race conscious. I became really aware of the very different experiences that people with different skin colors have in this country. And out of that, I wanted to devote my life to trying to figure out, what do you do with historical legacies like we have in the US? And it took me to working in many other countries, actually. I worked in Afghanistan and Iraq and Pakistan, Jordan, all over the Middle East, as well as you noted, in East and West Africa. And a lot of my international work in peace building, which is I ended up majoring this in college, peace studies, and then doing a PhD in conflict analysis and resolution, trying to figure out, how do you heal societies? How do you transform and become a more just and peaceful place for people to live, of all skin colors or all religions? And that question, it's a question that I still ask today. How do we do this? But a lot of my work in other countries was really trying to figure out what we do here at home. Because I think we've always had part of American society that I would say is extremist. And the term violent extremism, if I could just define that for us,
Yeah,
it's
please.
it's kind of a combination of a belief that violence is the best way to solve problems. It's a distrust of political processes like democracy, which, in the US, we're trying to have a multicultural democracy where people of all skin colors, of all religions, of all classes have an equal say when it comes to voting day. And as we know, past and present, that's been really challenged because part of the American population doesn't want people of a certain skin color to vote. And we see all kinds of voter restrictions happening right now across the country. So extremism is about, sort of this belief that violence, not elections, should, solve problems, but also that there is a superiority in one religion or one skin color over another. So, after 9/11, I worked in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. I'm very familiar with the Taliban and other extremist groups that I've sat down and talked with. And it's remarkable how similar they are, I would say, between other countries and the United States. And this belief that, Sunni Muslims are superior to Shia, is one of the elements of ISIS extremism. And this idea that you're trying to create what ISIS wants to do is create a caliphate, which is a pure Islamic society where it's very authoritarian and patriarchal, and there's no democracy, there's no multiculturalism, there's no diversity. It's the top guy says what it's like, and then everybody else follows. Well, that's very similar to what the right wing in the U.S. wants as well, with this internalized superiority of white people being superior. They want this purity of an all-white state with no more multiculturalism, no democracy, just a couple of white guys telling everybody else what to do. And that's a violent extremist ideology when you start picking up guns and trying to force people to believe in that. So I have an interesting life in terms of being able to compare white extremism with ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the kind of extremism we see in the Middle East.
Wow, thank you. Like we said at the beginning, you have so much expertise and knowledge. And I think you bring up a good point. We have a deep history in this country of systemic racism, of extremism. What's been interesting lately, and what you've actually written an article on, is that added layer now of social media on top of all of these embedded systems that already were in place and plaguing our country. Now we have social media on top of that, where we can have this rapid spread of misinformation and making it very difficult for people to figure out, or at least tease apart, what are facts or what conspiracies they're falling for. Actually, in your article, it states social media is not solely responsible for the January 6th siege. Social media amplified rather than generated those problems. Last week, we spoke with Mark Pitcavage from ADL, and he mentioned that we, seemingly have this new form of extremism shaped by Trump supporters, a sort of new cult of personality that's really different than other types of American extremism, something we've historically seen more in other countries, and now we're seeing it in American culture. So what is your opinion on the role of social media and mainstream conspiracies for this new group, and really how mainstream has it become?
Right. Excellent question. So I would really trace a return to a vibrant, violent extremism in the U.S. to Rush Limbaugh. Who really, when Rush Limbaugh's talk show started on the radio, his goal was to tear apart the news media system in the United States. And he talked about the four corners of deceit being science, academia, the news media. He was really trying to delegitimate sources of authority, that how we answer questions about do masks work or what is COVID. Basically he's been on the attack for legitimate information for decades. And by tearing apart the mainstream media, which is how the right wing attacks it, he set the stage for then a social media system in which there is no way for most people to figure out what is legitimate news and what is not. So all kinds of false conspiracies and false information floats on social media, and people just think, well, it's printed and therefore it must be true. So, the QAnon conspiracy is a really interesting one because I've watched all their videos and they keep touting themselves as being the ones who are fighting fake news and doing the real hard research. But as soon as you start researching any of their claims, they completely fall apart. So actually, they're depending on people not doing any research because, it's, and I've had good friends who've fallen into the QAnon trap because social media makes everything confusing. People don't know how to determine and distinguish false information from true information. And so people on the left and the right, they see a meme quoting Thomas Jefferson and they just assume it's true. They don't actually do the work of looking up, did Thomas Jefferson actually say that? Or is some political actor or, hack who wants to make money from clickbait just posting something and then people start sharing it? And what we have found on social media is that the things that get shared the most are often the false things. That if you post something false or some conspiracy that makes you angry or feel an intense emotion, people spread that virally. They just push the share button and they start sharing things that amplify an emotional reaction. And so the whole design of social media, unfortunately, is actually geared toward sharing false and inflammatory information. The big companies like Facebook and Twitter make their profit from that kind of emotional engagement that is actually false. So the whole profit model, the economic model of social media has really amplified the problem of hate speech and conspiracies and disinformation because you have companies and shareholders making billions and billions of dollars off of the spread of this stuff. And so solving the problem is really kind of complex. It involves regulation of the social media technology companies, but also helping the American public see the difference between, what is fake news and what is real news, how to ask the questions and think critically about it.
Yeah. So I'm curious, obviously critical thinking is important, and that gets taught really, not until, upper education, sometimes not even then.
I was gonna say
sometimes not even then. Yeah. But even more than that, we have to question what we're seeing, really at all times. So, I wonder who is most susceptible to these conspiracy theories, or what types of characteristics do they typically have?
Well, I think everyone, all of us are vulnerable. I know I have shared things on social media that I later found out were false and I didn't do my research. And so I think it's not a political thing. It's people on the left and the right are sharing false information, and we all have to get better at doing the research and pretty much assuming that if we see it on social media, unless it is, it's probably, you have to check everything. Even stories that say they're from the New York Times, sometimes that information is not from the New York Times. Somebody's made it up and made it look to be like it's from the New York Times. So we really have to get into the practice of researching everything. What we do know is that there is a correlation between people who vote for extremist policies and their level of education. It is more people who have not as many educational opportunities or not taken those opportunities. So there is a vulnerability. So education is an immunization, you could say, against disinformation to some degree. It's just not 100% foolproof.
Of course.
Yeah.
Thank you. So some of these social media platforms, they've begun deplatforming, right? People who pose these social media harms, but you've also expressed that this does little to dismantle or deprogram these conspiracies. So you speak more on using a peace-building response to move Americans beyond these falsehoods. And one of the necessary components of this is unraveling this white supremacy and patriarchal culture in our society, right? So can you tell us more about why this is a necessary part of the approach and how we begin to even go about it?
Right. First of all, I do think deplatforming is an important response. It's just not the only response.
Of course.
So, for example, when Trump was deplatformed from Twitter and Facebook, you could measure the decrease in disinformation. So it had a measurable effect. I think there was 70% fewer lies trafficking U.S. social media. I mean, it was tremendous.
Wow.
There's a story. Actually, don't quote me on the 70%, but it was a dramatically big
But
number.
high, yes. Something to make you drop your jaw.
So removing one person had a dramatic effect on how much disinformation was being shared.
Yeah.
So we know that it works. It's just that, people who spread in disinformation are playing on historical grievances and narratives. And I think that was my point in starting out by saying, I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, where they laugh, the Civil War is not over. And the fact that we've been able to ignore that, white people have been able to ignore that, I should say, for decades, in some ways, it's only Trump has surfaced everything that was still there. We never healed as a society. Police brutality, like what we saw with George Floyd, those kinds of murders have been happening consistently over hundreds of years. It's not like we were okay and now we're not okay in the Trump era or with the right-wing extremists. There are deeper problems in our society that need to be addressed. White supremacy is one of them. White supremacy is something that we have all grown up with. One of my Black evangelical friends who's a pastor, says, like, everybody's a white supremacist. African Americans are white supremacists too, because we all grew up believing that, white culture and white leadership was somehow natural and normal. And what was interesting about the South African experience coming out of apartheid is was this deliberate, step beginning with Black conscientization, which was unlearning all the stuff about white supremacy within the South African context. That actually, white language, white culture is not better than Black culture. We all have to unlearn that because it's been drilled into us so much. And so when I talk about white supremacy, I'm not talking about some far off group on the right, which, is a sizable sum for us now. It's actually the whole country has to go through a process of de-radicalizing our white supremacist assumptions about how the world works and what has value and worth. And so, I think over the last half century with, the TV series Roots and lots of other movies and Hollywood productions, each of them nips away at white supremacy a little bit. But we actually, the textbook, I have a high school student, my son is in high school, his history book in Virginia is still appalling to me in terms of what it teaches about slavery, because it leaves a lot of people with a very shallow understanding of what slavery was about. It leaves the impression that, white masters were working in the fields and that it was more of a benevolent system and it didn't involve torture and separation of families and rape. It doesn't mention the horror of slavery. And it leaves students with the sense that, maybe it was not okay, but our country needed it to get economically ahead. And I think all of those myths and beliefs that are still in our history books really, they set the stage for the murder of George Floyd. It's not just the white police who rely on violence and oppression too much. It's a much wider problem in our society. So when I talk about a peace-building response to the mainstreaming of violent extremism in our country, we have to do a lot of work in a lot of different areas, from social media to the news media to our history books to Hollywood and what they put out there to help us understand the divisions in this country.
And you bring up George Floyd, and the George Floyd incident was actually part of really what started this podcast for us, just observing that and being appalled by that. And much of our first season was about looking at where we are as a country, how we got here, and what are the different elements that we need to really take a good hard look at. And policing is for sure one of those, right? Community policing and law enforcement intelligence, when we read, a lot of the work in extremism is necessary in terms of the fight against extremism. However, they also really need to take responsibility for the part that they play in perpetuating white supremacy. So, why the need? How do we kind of reconcile this and find the balance between, valuing the community policing to play a part in fighting extremism, but then also, reckoning with what the damage has been on communities as well?
I really recommend and support the Black Lives Matter movement's approach to thinking about policing. We really have to start all over in this country. Because American policing grew out of slave patrols, we have to unravel this whole idea of what is community safety, and is it for everyone, or is it designed to protect some people and not other people? I think we know the answer to that in this country. It's not designed for everybody. And in order to really have a system that protects everybody and is about community safety, we need to start all over. And I'm glad a few cities in the US have started having that conversation. Maybe you've already got some speakers planned, but some of the research is coming out now on how much the Black Lives Matter movement improved community safety. Even if there was just one protest by the Black Lives Matter movement in a city, my city here in Virginia, for example, those cities that had protests had fewer killings. So just even having a protest alone makes a difference. That was in Scientific American just this last week, that research study. But the cities that started adding emotional support teams, or taking more of a social work approach to responding to calls, again, the research is in, it works. You can't just send armed people out to don't understand the community, don't have good relations with the community. So I think we have started that conversation on how do we start over on community safety, and maybe policing has a part of it, and I think what happened on January 6th makes the policing conversation more confusing and interesting, because those police officers, both officers of color and white officers, took a lot of violence from the right wing to protect the vote. That was happening that day in terms of the election. And so they defended democracy, and they played a role in protecting the multiculturalism and the value of all people's votes. And I'm grateful for them, and I see the role of law enforcement in terms of what happened that day, and certainly what's happened in the weeks since then as they've been arresting the leaders of right-wing movements. But that doesn't negate everything else that has happened in law enforcement. And so it's how do we have a conversation about policing that includes George Floyd to January 6th and everything that happens in between? Because it's a complex story. And again, if everybody's safety matters, we have to design a security system that really takes that as the starting.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you touched on some great things that came to mind. So for starters, we had interviewed Michelle Perrin from Cahoots out in Oregon, and they're partnered with Whitebird Clinic. And Cahoots partners with the police department there. And so when you call into 911, you can be dispatched to the police or you can be dispatched to Cahoots. And so they deal with a lot of mental health crisis and things like that. And the drop in, assault, killings, and getting folks connected to the help that they really need is just astronomical. And then the amount of money that they save because of that, and so really it's a win for everyone. And to hear, I'm going to definitely check out that, you said Scientific American.
I'll send it to you.
Yeah, please do, because DeSantis here is trying to implement an anti-protest bill. And so, what you just said exactly really speaks to that, to even just hear, the violence decreases because of protests is something that I had never really thought of. So thank you.
Well, and I was wondering if you could clarify some of also what we've seen, again, social media or the kind of news outlets is trying to refer to the Black Lives Matter movement as extremism. So can you clarify a little bit of that for us and kind of talk a little bit about the difference between a protest movement and actual extremism?
Right. Good question. So again, the definition of violent extremism is a group of people who have a belief that some people are superior to others. And secondly, they would see others as somehow polluting society. So they have what we call as a purity narrative. They believe in pure societies where there's no multiculturalism, there's no diversity. And then thirdly, they believe in the use of violence to create that pure society. Black Lives Matter doesn't fit any three of those. Black Lives Matter is not about saying black people are superior to white people. The whole Black Lives Matter movement is about all people's lives have mattered, and black people's lives have not mattered, and therefore we need to say Black Lives Matter. But that is not saying that white lives don't matter. Absolutely, it's a movement for human rights for everybody, and saying in this country and in other countries, Black lives matter. Black lives have not been valued and have not had the human rights that other people have. Actually, the whole term white privilege is kind of, people are critiquing it now, saying, white privilege is just about white people having human rights. It shouldn't be a privilege if you're talking about human rights. Everybody should have human rights. That's the definition of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, one, Black Lives Matter is not a violent extremist group because it does not have a superiority narrative. It is not trying to create a pure society. It doesn't say white people are polluting. It's not at all about that purity narrative. And it absolutely isn't using violence. 94% of the Black Lives Matter protests were peaceful. What we know about the other 6% is that the FBI knows that there were white extremists trying to start violence. We don't know exactly what percentage of that 6% that were violent was caused by Black Lives Matter supporters, either white or black, because there was white anarchists there as well, and they may have started, they support Black Lives Matter, but they might have started some of that violence because there is a wing of white anarchy that believes in the use of violence. But, it's a non-violent movement, and so it does not fit any of the criteria of violent extremism.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Sometimes it's just so hard to argue with folks about that, and it's pretty apparent. So, Lisa, you referred to this information ecosystem and a need for a new fairness doctrine meant to address the partisan media across the political spectrum. Can you explain more about this, and what would that entail?
So the fairness doctrine is something the U.S. used to have, saying that if you were producing news, you needed to give sort of a variety of different political opinions. And that fairness doctrine ended, and that's as soon as you got Fox News and CNN. And so it actually happened more, I think CNN used to be more neutral than it is now. I think it swings pretty hard left now. But when you start getting this kind of polarized news where the news anchors are giving commentary and people are confused about whether it's commentary or if it's news, this is not a good situation. Like when we used to have, the ABC, NBC, CBS, those are still following the fairness doctrine to a large extent, I would say, in terms of really trying to have a variety of political opinions, um, and trying to present facts and not opinions. But, Fox News has taken this the farthest in terms of really just spreading, I would say, spreading false information under the guise of news, because they will say, well, somebody said, or I've heard it said, or they say. These kinds of phrases aren't actually evidence. They're not facts. It's when you're interviewing somebody and they say that. So, yeah, we need a new fairness doctrine in the United States, because people who are providing news information need to have a responsibility to present the public facts without a lot of political opinion. And the facts need to be established based on legal terms like human rights and professional journalistic standards like triangulation and finding, backup sources that before you start making a claim that the liberals support abortion or whatever, no, the liberals don't support abortion. That's a real twisting of the actual facts of what abortion, for example, is about. So, yeah, sort of a fairness doctrine would help people establish some criteria for journalism that is not based on trying to smear the other political side.
Yeah, sounds like a decent start.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of what we've been talking about, such as the new fairness doctrine and the need for responsible policing, and these, different approaches were in your article, 12 Peacebuilding Strategies for the American Insurgency. And in that article, you stated that reducing threats from an insurgency requires separating insurgents from their base of support in the population. And much of that work has been done internationally using that approach, and it's been successful in decreasing violence. So how would you reimagine countering extremism here in the United States using these peace-building approaches?
Right. So groups like that were launching the January 6th siege have a broader support. And the statistics that you read off at the beginning of this program indicate how many Americans support them politically. But also, they have financial support. They have financial support from My Pillow, for example, the guy who sends them lots of money. But a lot of evangelical churches have also been donating money to these causes. So what we've done, for example, in Afghanistan or Iraq, is when you trace the money from extremist groups, if they go, for example, back to a specific mosque, the CIA's been tracing that money and finding ways of cutting off that funding. So that's what I mean by separating the insurgents from the population, because the insurgents can't survive if they're not getting funding from local mosques in the Middle East or local churches here in the United States. And so the conversation about what kind of society do we want, and do we want to solve problems with violence, and taking over the Capitol building and threatening to hang the vice president, who's a Republican. The vast Republican support for the siege, I think, is really very disturbing and a very concerning sign about how fragmented our society is and how many people don't trust the election because of the misinformation that has been spread on social media about it. So yeah, we need a much wider strategy. Again, it's not just arresting the people who were there January 6th. It's thinking about, why do these ideas continue to thrive in the society, and how do we undermine the logic or the lack of logic that underpins that?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question for all of us to think about moving forward as well,
Yeah.
So that kind of wraps up our episode for today. Before we go, we always like to ask, who in this field or what other organizations should we be following to stay informed on counter-extremism and peace-building work?
So there's a group in the United States called Life After Hate, and they are a group that are all former white supremacists. So they used to belong to the far-right movement and believe in violence and violent extremism, and they have left. And they do workshops now in schools, and they're very active in trying to help Americans understand the appeal of white supremacist movements and how we're going to reconstruct our society so that it is fair and it works for everyone. So look at Life After Hate. They have a bunch of videos, too, of those white supremacist staff who now talk about how personal relationships in their lives helped them move out of those violent movements. The other group you've mentioned, ADL, Anti-Defamation League, is great. The Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC, watches extremist groups. They do a lot of writing and analysis of what motivates them, who's funding them. So that whole separating the insurgents from their base in the population, SPLC is doing the majority of that work. So those are the three organizations that I think do the most work. There's a few others as well, but
okay.
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for coming onto the Unpack Project today. Your work was a large part of our research this season, preparing for extremism conversation. And so having this conversation with you was really eye-opening. So thank you so much. For all of our listeners out there, don't forget to subscribe to the Unpack Project channel on YouTube. That is new this season. All of our episodes are uploaded weekly, so check it out. And we'll see you all next week. Bye.
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 Show the Unpack Project some love and be sure to like, subscribe, and review our podcast. You can also check us out on Instagram at _Unpack Project.
And if you enjoyed today's episode, visit our website at theunpackedproject.com, where you can make a donation that supports the research, production, and operating costs of this work.
Shout out to all of our listeners who unpacked with us today.
See you next week.
Peace.